Pull out your Babylonian folders there so we can get started here. We're going to jump right into it. Again, the whole idea behind the series that we're undertaking is that we've gone through the book of Revelation, and we want to be able to quickly identify this harlot, this great whore that rides the seven-headed beast. We've talked much about her. We've heard much about her. This particular instance, we've actually come to realize that there are certain criteria that she's got to line up with and meet according to the book of Revelation, the 18th chapter. And I listed those things on those handouts that I gave you. There are just certain things that we have to be able to touch on to identify it. Again, we're not looking for the Mormons. We're not looking for Jehovah's Witnesses. We're not looking for Catholics. We're not looking for some offshoot aspect of Islam, something that we can put our finger on and say, oh, this is the false religion. This is the great whore. This is through what system she's going to be coming from, because the identification of her is just so plain in the book of Revelation 18. The Bible says that the saints are always bedding her down. I mean, she's drunk on the blood of the saints. The fact that the Bible makes plain that she literally fornicates with everybody, kings, great men, churchmen, everybody gets a piece of her. Doesn't sound like somebody we need to get a hold of or get to know real good, but she's bad. So what we're doing is we're going through aspects of history. And what we did last week was we dealt with some introductions to some of the books that we're going to deal with. If you'd like to, we're going to be printing up a bibliography of all the things and all the books that we're going to be taking things out of. And if you want to, you can go out and buy them yourself. And I'll tell you what, you'll have some real good reading. You'll find that as you read these things, you'll be able to see things. Many times the question asked, and it's something that's it's a very good question at that, and that is anybody can write books, anybody can publish books. How do we know which ones we're getting and which ones we're reading? One of the things that we're looking at, and one of the things that at least I want to make you aware of, is that there's a lot of books that basically have prognosticated many things and many happenings by locating facts. One of the reasons that we touched on some of these introductions and literally had to at least dispel or get rid of the stigma of what many would refer to as conspiracy theories, because this is what you're referred to, or this is what they call you, a conspiracy theorist, if you somehow begin to fill in the blanks with facts you begin to know. So what these books are doing at least is they're laying out some facts. They're things that are indisputable, things that, again, you're not going to be taught in history. And again, we've seen that there are, in fact, these organizations, those which Gary Allen refers to as the landscape painters, those who very carefully and tediously sanitize our versions of history. This is why our history in all levels of education start with 1492 with Columbus. This is why the only dates we remember is 1492 as well as 1776, the day of our independence. But even then, our history is sanitized when we don't really understand the ramifications of why we broke free from Great Britain, more so than just a bunch of people mad and throwing tea into the harbor, because that's what we're told, that everybody got mad at the idea of taxation without representation, that they got upset by the notions of Great Britain placing taxes and establishing policy on this U.S. colony that was British without the consent nor with the permission of those who were a participant in this country or in this colony. We don't hear anything about the Presbyterians, which is one of the main, it was the main religion, 600,000 Presbyterians in the early colonies. They didn't like the idea of the king sending over an Anglican bishop to be in charge. A lot of things we don't hear about. So we find these facts, and we now juxtapose these facts next to that which we refer to as history. And what we're going to do is be able to fill in a lot of the blanks. So what we're doing is we're filling in a lot of the blanks in what we've been reading. I'm going to read just a little bit out of None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And we've read a little bit of this introduction. Some of you that have gotten this, I hope you took it home and read it. We're going to be making more copies of some of these things so that you can actually take it home and read it. But I hope you took it home and read it so that you can get a hold of exactly what it is that is being taught here. What we're doing is we're identifying Babylon. There's no way Babylon fits the profile of any religion. Again, one of my favorite aspects of Babylon is that she sleeps with everybody and that she possesses everything. The church doesn't do that, and there's no religion in this world that has that power. The merchants cry when she dies. It's not talking about a religious system. It's not even talking about a geographic location necessarily. So we'll read a little bit about what this system is. I think the faster we get this system down, the faster we'll be able to at least be able to identify her. All right, this is out of the 3rd chapter, if you want to write it down so you can look it up. Again, you can buy these books almost anywhere. Mine's a real old copy, and half my stuff's all fallen out of it too. Yeah. It says, many college history professors tell their charges that the books they'll be using in class are objective, but if you stop and ask yourself, is it possible to write a history book without a particular point of view? There are billions of events that take place in the world each day. To think of writing a complete history of a nation, covering even a year, is absolutely incredible. Not only is a historian's ability to write an objective history limited by the sheer volume of happenings, but the fact that many of the most important happenings never appear in the papers or even in somebody's memoirs. The decisions are reached by the big boys in smoke-filled rooms. They're not reported even in the New York Times, which ostensibly report all the news that fit to print. All the news that fits is probably more accurate description. I think you're all aware of this, that there are things that happen in our country, in our history, that aren't ever listed. There are things that happen today that aren't in the news. And if you stop and ask yourself, why aren't they in the news? And if you come up with a theory or an idea as to why it's not on the news, what do people say about you? That you're paranoid or that you're a conspiracy theorist, right? I mean, my favorite story is that one I was watching the news and I saw the cat getting dragged out of a tree at City Hall. I was trying to figure out why in a half-hour news broadcast that even made the news when all kinds of other things are happening. And yet I changed it from Channel 2 to Channel 4 to Channel 7, and it was on all the channels. Anybody interested in a stupid cat? I'm not. So if you ask the simple question, who's in charge of distributing the news? Who's in charge of telling these particular networks what stories to air? Doesn't that bother you? Have you ever seen something happen by your house and then say, I'm going to see the news, see if it's on, you don't even see it? So the question that you got to ask. Most of the facts that we bring out are readily verifiable in any large library, but our contention is that we've arranged these facts in the order which most accurately reveal the true significance in history. These are the facts the establishment does not want you to know. Have you ever had the experience of walking into a mystery movie 2/3 of the way in? Confusing, wasn't it? All the evidence made it look as if the butler was the murderer, but in the final scenes you find out surprisingly that it was the man's wife all along. You have to stay and see the beginning of the film. Then all the pieces fall into play, then the story makes sense. This situation is similar to the one in which millions of Americans find themselves today. They're confused by current happenings in the nation. They have come in as the movie, so to speak, is going into its conclusion. The earlier portion of the mystery is needed to make the whole thing understandable. Actually, we're not really starting at the beginning, but we're going back far enough to give meaning to today's happenings. So much of what we're doing is that. A lot of times, most of us do not care about the things that have been happening in our government until at least we get to an age where suddenly we are affected by the things taking place, and it's at that point that suddenly we start paying attention, right? There was a time when I was in high school where the only thing I cared about was missing Vietnam, and that was it. Now, the only reason I know all about Watergate was because it was on every channel, right? And then they had the hearings. But there's a lot of things that took place back then. I can't remember. I remember Apollo 13 because that was all in the news too. But all the other happenings that took place during that time, man, good luck. I was out on the football field, out in the street playing baseball all day long. I could care less about the news. So there comes a point in our lives where suddenly we're adults and we're mature, we're working, and suddenly the idea of a recession means something to us, right? Back when I was a kid, I got a new truck, and suddenly I'm waiting in gas lines. All right? So it's at that point that suddenly these things become interesting. Now, from that point on, if you decided I'm going to start from this point and understand my environment and my surroundings, that's like walking into a movie late. You missed everything that led up to those things. Now, a lot of us have never gone back to try to fill in the blanks and understand things. A lot of us don't understand why we're in the positions we are. And we always hear a lot of things that at least we're going to deal with, because what we're talking about is a system. We're talking about Babylon. We're talking about something that is inherently evil, To the extent that when God deals with Libya, when God deals with Egypt, when God deals with Turkey, when God deals with the nations that he wants to destroy, and in the end time, at the end of the book of Revelation, God pours out his vials of wrath on the nations, and just when he's done with that last vial of wrath, it says Babylon suddenly comes into his mind, and God got something special for her. What does that tell you about Babylon? Huh? Isn't that funny how God wants Babylon worst of all? Huh? He wants this system destroyed. And many of us have never been able to identify this system, but the system is literally laid out in a criteria that shows that we are all enmeshed and tangled in her without even knowing it. And you've heard me many times, I think we have the greatest government on the planet. But I also think, and I also believe, in fact, I know that we also are living in a time where our government is becoming oppressive. I remember a time when we were kids when they said, you know what's terrible about Russia in comparison to the U.S.? In the U.S. you can speak your mind, and in Russia you can't say nothing without getting dragged off to the gulag. Right? Now the Iron Curtain fell, they're talking it up, and we can't even say anything anymore. Right? We even got people that'll tell you how to think nowadays. We were all afraid of communism, and now it's flip-flopped on us. God forbid you tell a gay joke. Huh? God forbid you tell a blonde joke. Y'all can lose your job, can't you? Y'all can get sued. What's happening? Again, some folk walked into the movie late. Don't know why it got there, why it happened. All they know is that it's here. Babylon's a system that the devil literally controls. It's a system that literally takes the saints captive, and she gets drunk from the blood of the saints. Takes them right off the track that God wanted them. In order to understand the conspiracy, it is necessary to have some rudimentary knowledge of banking, and particularly of international bankers. While it would be an oversimplification to ascribe the entire conspiracy to international bankers, they nevertheless have played a key role. Think of the conspiracy as a hand with one finger labeled international banking, the other one foundations, anti-religious movement, Fabian socialism, and communism. But it was the international bankers whom Professor Quigley was speaking of when he quoted, stating that their aim was nothing less than to control the world through finance. So, Gary Allen refers to this as a conspiracy because really there's no other way to describe this system that even back in the early 1900s was already at work to literally take its foothold in the world, not only our country but in the world, and prospering. Where do governments get the enormous amounts of money they need? Most, of course, comes from taxation, but governments often spend more than they're willing to tax from their citizens, so they're forced to borrow. Our national debt is now, this is back in the 1970s, $455 billion. Every cent of it borrowed at the interest from somewhere else. The public is led to believe that our government borrows money from the people through savings bonds. Actually, only the smallest percentage of the national debt is held by individuals in this form. Most government bonds, except those owned by the government itself, through its trust funds, are held by vast banking firms known as international banks. For centuries, there has been big money to be made by international bankers and financing of governments and kings. Such operators are faced, however, with certain thorny problems. We know the smaller banking operations protect themselves by taking collateral, but what kind of collateral can you get from a government or a king? So there are some individuals who decided they want to lend money to kings. To make a long story short, basically what happens when you lend money to a nation that doesn't have collateral, you have say in all of their foreign policy. You can decide what's good and what's bad. You can decide who to trade with, who not to trade with for them. So who runs the country? The king or the banker? The banker does. Economics professor Stuart Crane noted that there are two main areas used as collateral when loans are made to governments. Whenever a business firm borrows big money, its creditor obtains a voice in management to protect its investment. Like a business, no government can borrow big money unless it's willing to surrender to the creditor a measure of sovereignty as collateral. The ultimate advantage the creditor has over the king or the president is if the ruler gets out of line, the banker finances his enemy or his rival. I'm going to skip to the next page. Preeminent in playing this game was the famous House of Rothschild. Its founder, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, actually Bauer was his name, of Frankfurt, Germany, kept one of his 5 sons at home to run the Frankfurt Bank, sent the others to London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. The Rothschilds became incredibly wealthy during the 19th century by financing governments to fight each other, according to Professor Stuart Crane. If you look back at every war in Europe during the 19th century, you will see that they always ended with the establishment of a balance of power. With every reshuffling, there was a balance of power in the new grouping and around the House of Rothschild in England, France, or Austria. They grouped nations so that if any king got out of line, a war would break out, and the war would be decided by which way the financing went. Researching the debt positions of the warring nations will usually indicate who was to be punished. In describing characteristics of the Rothschild and other major international bankers, Dr. Quigley tells us that they remained different from ordinary bankers in several ways. They were cosmopolitan and international. They were close to governments and were particularly concerned with government debts, including foreign government debts. These bankers came to be known as international bankers. One of the major reasons the historical blackout on the role of the international bankers in political history is that the Rothschilds were Jewish. Anti-Semites have played into the hands of the conspiracy by trying to portray the entire conspiracy as Jewish. Nothing could be further from the truth. The traditional Anglo-Saxon, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller international banking institutions have also played a key role in the conspiracy, but there is no denying the importance of the Rothschilds and their satellites. However, it is just as unreasonable and immoral to blame Jews for all the crimes of the Rothschilds as it is to hold all Baptists accountable for the crimes of the Rockefellers. So this is one of the reasons why you just can't go off talking about Jews. By the way, they ended up financing Hitler, so they're not even good Jews at that. All right? When you finance Hitler, you're screwed. All right. Later on, we might tell you where Hitler came from, by the way. Give you a hint. His mother worked for the Rothschilds. She was a maid. Suddenly there was a conception. Suddenly. I'm going to read out a Tragedy and Hope. Carroll Quigley. We talked about him a little bit. Now, if you remember when we passed out our first set of sheets, one of the things that we dealt with was where the idea came from as far as capitalism. Capitalism came from Babylon, from Ur-Nammu, king of Babylon, who discovered that when he takes in gold to place it in the Ziggurat temple, that was the safest place you can bring your precious metals. They realized that when you take in gold and you're taking in deposits, that when people come in for loans, by holding at least a 20% reserve, you can lend up to 100 times what you have in reserve at 20% interest and make money. So the whole idea of banking as we know it today came from Babylon. Now the whole idea behind Daniel chapter 3 and Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the man, the head of gold, is Babylon, which doesn't fall until the stone kingdom strikes the image in the foot. So that whole system breaks down and collapses with the coming of Jesus. I think it's important for us to see these things, especially if we're able to put all the pieces together. Because as great as the government as we have, we find that much of what takes place becomes oppressive. The government doesn't do anything out of the goodness of his heart, by the way. I think a lot of you know that. You know, everything, in fact, I've often said this, anything that the government offers that says fair in front of it ain't fair. All right? Any benefit that the government gives does nothing but create a loyalty and create a poverty that most people that take their dole from the government will never ever experience freedom again. Carroll Quigley, let's see, we can pick this up in about the third chapter, industrial capitalism. If you got your pencil, if you want to buy one of these, I think after Bill Clinton came out of office and they were talking to him about, all his favorite stuff. They asked him what's his favorite book, and again, being a student out of Georgetown, he said, my favorite professor was my mentor, Carroll Quigley, and my favorite book is Tragedy and Hope. So there's copies of this out now for, I think if I'm not mistaken, $35. So go out and get yourself a copy of it if you can. Probably be some of the best reading. But I'm going to go ahead and read. Britain's victories over Louis XIV in the period of 1667 to 1715 and over the French revolutionary governments and Napoleon, 1792 to 1815, had many causes such as its insular position, its ability to retain control of the sea, its ability to present itself to the world as the defender of the freedoms and rights of small nations and of diverse social and religious groups. Among these numerous causes, there was also a financial one and an economic one. Financially, England had discovered the secret of credit. Economically, England embarked on the Industrial Revolution. Now, this portion of his book, it's actually History of Our Time, but it's his inside view to these international bankers that gives us this great perspective. He's talking about England. And what he's saying about England after the war is that something happened that was great in England that literally made it one of the greatest colonizing nations that the world has ever known. And it credits England with this greatness due to the discovery of credit. Now again, the whole idea behind credit is that all you have to do is hold a little bit in order to make a lot. I said last time, I think if most people understood the true concept of banking, they'd never do business with one again. Credit had been known to the Italians, the Netherlanders, long before it became one of the instruments of the English world supremacy. Nevertheless, the founding of the Bank of England by William Paterson and his friends in 1694 is one of the greatest dates in world history. For generations, men had sought to avoid the one drawback of gold, its heaviness, by using pieces of paper to represent specific pieces of gold. Nobody wants to carry around gold, so what they would do is hold it in deposit and literally hold a piece of paper that equaled the amount of value. That's what Ernamu did. You'd go in there and take 500 pieces of silver, and he'd write you a receipt on a clay tablet. Now, if you wanted to buy crops, you would take that clay tablet to the guy selling soil or land, and you'd say, look, I'll transfer this to you. And you'd stamp your seal on that and sell it to him. Was any money exchanged? Was any gold exchanged? What was exchanged? Nothing, merely credit on a bookkeeping tablet. So we're dealing with literally credit being a fancy word for bookkeeping, because there's no money being exchanged. It became clear that gold need not be held in hand, only the amount needed to cover the fraction or certificates likely to be presented for payment. Accordingly, the rest of the gold could be used for business purposes, or what amounts to be the same thing, a volume of certificates. All you had to do was hold enough gold to write or pass out paper certificates. Hold it in deposit. In fact, this is one of the reasons why Napoleon lost the war. Napoleon's France literally believed in the ideal of real money. And he believed because he had more real money in his possession that he can actually drive England bankrupt. But England began to borrow money, literally credit. Now, we don't need to know who won the war, right? All right, here's the key to this. In effect, the creation of paper claims greater than the reserves available means that bankers were creating money out of nothing. The same thing could be done in another way, not by note issuing banks, but by deposit banks. Deposit bankers discovered that orders and checks drawn against deposits by depositors and given to persons, third persons, were often not cashed by the latter, but were deposited into their own accounts. Thus, there were no actual movements of funds, and payments were made simply by bookkeeping transactions on the accounts. Accordingly, it was necessary for the banker to keep on hand actual money, gold certificates and notes, no more than the fraction of deposits likely to be drawn up in cash. The rest could be used for loans, and if these loans were made by creating a deposit for the borrower, who in turn would draw up checks on it rather than withdraw the money, such deposits or such created deposits or loans could also be covered adequately by retaining reserves to only a fraction of their value. Now, do you understand that this system that system of Babylon is the exact system we still use today? Huh? You get paid a check. You get any money when you get paid? What do you do with the check? You take it to the bank. What do you do with the bank? You deposit it, right? It goes into your account. And then when you get home, what do? You write checks, right? So where's the money? Where's the gold? Isn't that what happened here in Britain? They discovered that all you got to do is keep a portion. In fact, this is the way Ur-Nammu discovered it. As long as people make deposits, right here, as long as people make deposits, the priests get rich. If you make $1,000 in deposit, the bank takes 20% or $200 and keeps it here. $800 gets issued in notes or certificates. Somebody comes in and says, I need to borrow $1,000. I deposit $1,000, the bank now has $1,000. So here, Ur-Nammu's priest took in $1,000. He figured out if he keeps $200 in deposit, he made $800. Because that's all you need. So he can lend up to 100 times the amount he's got on deposit. So somebody comes and says, I want to borrow $1,000. So here comes Whitney. He says, I want to borrow $1,000. Where do I get the $1,000 from? You want to know where I get it from? Listen, by the time, let's say Charles comes and borrows $1,000. By the time Charles pays me back, how much did I get? How much did I get? I got $1,000 plus interest. At that point, it was 20%, so it's $1,200, right? Who gets the $1,200? I do, all of it. Why? That wasn't interest. Check this out. As long as these deposits come in, this is why I'm telling you, the banking's crazy. As long as those deposits keep coming in, if Charles comes and says, I want $1,000, check this out. I print them up, $1,000. Now, how can I do that? Well, because I know he's going to pay it back. And if he don't pay it back, I take his farm, and then I sell it and get $3,000. So I print up another $1,000. Now, where does that $1,000 go? Check this out. Charles borrows it, and what does he do? He deposits it. Right? So I put another $200 down here in my coffers, another $800 in here. Now I got more notes to pass out. Jeff brings in his gold, and I give him paper. Right? Jeff goes out and buys corn, grows it, makes $3,000, brings it in, and does what? Deposits it. Whitney comes and says, I need a tractor. I need $3,000. Where's the $3,000 come from? From the deposits? No. I make $3,000 for Whitney. Print it. Here you go. Right? And when Whitney pays me back plus interest, what happens? Goes right back in, right? Now Ur-Nammu discovered this. This is Babylon. 1,500 years later, Nebuchadnezzar comes, sets up the gold standard in Babylon, and says, everybody bow down and worship when you hear the trumpets, when you hear the instruments. That was the gold standard that he established. The priests figured this out. Well, Britain figures this out. The Germans figured it out. And again, why do we know that this came to Europe? Because it went first from the Sogs, the Iranian Sogs. And the Iranian Sogs were who? They were Judah mixed with Phoenicians and Egyptians who were taken captive by the Babylonians, thrown between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And they were thrown up there to the north. And they sat up there. Many of those were known as the Persian kingly line. But upon Alexander's kingdom moving eastward, it forced them north and west into Europe. So these whole banking ideals went from Babylon into Europe. So does it surprise you that suddenly at a time in history, suddenly these ideas come back? All right. Accordingly, it was necessary for the banker to keep on hand in actual money or gold certificates no more than the fraction of deposits likely to be drawn upon in cash. They figured out that the chances of everybody that deposited coming in and asking for their money was not going to happen. 20% was the magic number. They keep that on deposit. The rest is theirs. They lend out money. Every time somebody wants a loan, they make new money. They don't have to give you old money. They make new money. All right. Such created deposits also were a creation of money out of nothing. Although bankers usually refuse to express their actions, either note issuing or deposit lending in these terms, William Patterson, however, obtaining the charter of the Bank of England in 1694 to use the monies he had won in privateering, said the bank has benefit of interest on all money which it creates out of nothing. So the bank makes interest on money that it makes out of what? Nothing. Does the bank need gold to make money? Just needs to hold a reserve. This organizational structure for creating means of payment out of nothing is what we call credit. It was not invented in England, but was developed by her to become one of her chief weapons in her victory over France in 1815. All right. Now again, we're going through Europe in history, at least to establish where these ideas come from and how this works. Now again, Gary Allen said to blame all of this on international bankers isn't fair, because it were as if you had a hand with international banking only being one finger. You got foundations. You've got communism. You've got the anti-religion movement. You've got several aspects of this all controlled on the same hand. Just like God's word says in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it says, we're all members, yet of the same body. Yet the eye cannot say. Okay? We're all various members, but different parts. Now the devil's system isn't any different. You're not going to find it all in one part. You're going to find it in various parts making up the whole. And I think you're going to be surprised as to what makes up the whole. It's not just the international bankers. When you're dealing with people such as these, you're going to also be dealing with their foundations. Almost every charitable foundation you can think of is theirs. You're going to be shocked to know that the greatest endowments are placed in the universities. Again, the whole idea of the Rothschilds being great philanthropists and men of higher refinement, you'll find that they were the greatest supporters of the universities and the arts. So, to our surprise, or not to our surprise, you'll find that the universities become nothing more than a launching pad for their ideologies. You'll find that much of what is given through government, what they refer to as assistance, is nothing more than a means by which they will continue to control. All right, let's see. All right, Financial Capitalism from 1850 to 1931. This is page 50 if you want to get your book. The center of that system was in London. It's still there, with major offshoots in New York, Paris, and it has left as its greatest achievement an integrated banking system and heavily capitalized, if now largely obsolescent, framework of heavy industry reflected in railroad, steel mills, coal mines, and electrical utilities. This system has a center in London for four chief reasons. Number one, England had money. Number two, they had an oligarchy, a social structure that allowed, rather than this great aristocracy to rule, they had this system, a social system that allowed any schmuck with money, anybody with an idea, to participate in advance and reach this level of, I guess, respect without being pedigreed, all right, like the French or the Europeans. They had skill in financing. They were already used to trade, and they were already used to international banking. So this is one of the reasons why, even today, the heads of, I guess, modern financing are still based in London. And with this September 11th World Trade Center happening, a lot of us found out that the gold standard still set in London goes right to the World Trade Center. The merchant bankers of London had already a hand in 1810 to 1850 the stock exchange, the Bank of England, the London market, when the needs of the advancing industrialism called all of these into the industrial world, which they had hitherto ignored. In time, they brought into their financial network the provincial banking centers, organized commercial bank, savings bank, as well as insurance companies to form all these into a single financial system on an international scale, which manipulated the quantity and flow of money so that they were able to influence, if not control, governments on one side and industries on the other. The men who did this, looking backward toward the period of dynastic monarchy in which they had their own roots, aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers, and were at least as successful as this were many of the dynastic political rulers. So these people, they had only one mean or one end in mind, that is the control of governments, as well as the control of business. The greatest of these dynasties, of course, were the descendants of Meyer, Amschel, Rothschild, of Frankfurt, whose male descendants, at least for 2 generations, generally married their first cousins or even nieces. It's to ensure pedigree. Now, a lot of people, you don't think much of it. We look at that and think that's crazy, but if you think like these people, there is a necessity to preserve your pedigree and the strong genes from your family. See, people don't understand why a lot of the royals are called blue bloods, but the reason the royals are called blue bloods is because they used to marry each other to preserve not just a lineage and a pedigree, but genetic makeup of each individual. The fastest or the best way to produce the strongest genes of the father, probably to marry a relative of the father. Let me read something to you while we stop there. You'll like this. I think you'll like this, especially since George W. is in office. Because a lot of folk, they just don't understand how entwined these people are in the system. As we go through these things, at least write down the notes. I told you that in much of what we speak, we're going to be finding that a lot of what we dig up are going to basically be facts. What your role to do is to take those facts together and literally fill in the spaces or fill in the blanks. All right. A lot of times we run into these names by accident. And because we run into them by accident, suddenly other doors open. And as these other doors open, you begin to, at least you're forced to investigate as to why these things are happening or why these names keep popping up. But the reason these names keep popping up is because these people all married each other. And they're all very well connected as far as the ideal goes and as far as family goes. A lot of, I guess, people would think you're crazy if you really undertake this study. And they think you're crazy because you'll be reading things that they'll never read. You'll start to see things that they'll never see. You'll start to understand things they'll never understand. And I think the hardest thing about this is that it's too much information to process. All right. By the time of his death in 1937, Rockefeller and his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had not only built up an amazing oil empire, but they established such institutions as the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, established in 1901, the General Education Board, 1903, the University of Chicago, 1889, the Rockefeller Foundation, 1913, the Lincoln School, 1972, where the Rockefeller children began their education, and the Rockefeller University in New York City. The Rockefellers were also greatly interested in the eugenics movement, a program scientifically applied selection to maintain or improve the ideal human characteristics, including birth and population control. Now, isn't that something that these rich folk, they got nothing better to do? They're gonna now control eugenics. Now, whose eugenics you think they're more interested in? Their own. All right? So when you hear about human cloning and all that, in fact, That's another book. Pawns in the Game. We'll read that too. He goes further. He made a decision, or he made a conclusion that as the future went, as the genetic code would be broken, he wrote it back in the 60s, but he said as the genetic code would be broken, he made the statement that the lower caste of this country would be not allowed to breed. All right, he made this statement because that was the conclusion he drew because of these type of studies. Now, see, this is why you'll read that and say, oh, that didn't happen, that's crap. But again, let's take out his conclusion and let's understand the facts. So they're interested in the eugenics movement. Now, this is back in the early 1900s. Now, what was happening back in the early 1900s? Well, we had World War I, right? We're on the brink of World War I coming up. Early 1900s, they basically started making autos. U.S. was isolationist. We didn't want nothing to do with anybody. We were protected by two oceans. And these rich folk are into eugenics. Anybody know anything about eugenics in the 1900s? To improve the ideal human characteristics, including birth and population control. This idea grew from the writings of the Victorian scientist Sir Francis Galton, who after study reached a conclusion that prominent members of British society were such because they had eminent parents, thus combining Darwin's concept of the survival of the fittest with the class-conscious question, who's your daddy? So it's pedigree. And I've told you often, throughout my teachings, pedigree is everything. Can you imagine? Prominent members of the British society were such because they had eminent parents. What's that mean? If you got rich parents, if you got parents who think they're genetically superior, then you're genetically superior. By the way, listen, let's not, and again, what we're also going to do here is going to, for the lack of better terms, is going to piss some people off. Because we've all been sold a bill of goods that is nothing more than bullcrap. All right? We've been told that humanity all lays across one level and we're all the same because we're human beings. So if you get a Chinese guy, a Mexican guy, a Puerto Rican guy, a black guy, a white guy, a Russian guy, you get all nationalities and you line up a representative across this platform. We have been told everybody is the same and has the exact same capabilities. Isn't that what we've been told? It's bull crap. It is bull. Hey, listen, Whitney, Sandra, do you think anytime soon that the NBA is going to get taken over, or at least is going to be equaled out by the white people? Wait a minute. How about the 100-meter sprints? Is there any time soon that a Mexican guy is going to line up on the line and beat Maurice Green? Is that going to happen? Look, let's be honest. Let's be brutally honest. Is a Mexican going to get on that 100-meter line and whoop all them black dudes? Yeah. He needs some more medicine. He needs more eugenics. Do we all agree that the white man that can't jump is not going to take over the NBA anytime soon? Do we all agree with that? Do we all agree that there isn't going to be a Mexican 100-meter champ that's going to line up and whoop all them black dudes? Huh? Listen, a lot of people are going to get mad. A lot of people are not going to like this because we're taught this stuff and we're told this ideal, and it isn't true. Now, when you tell this to people, do you think white people get mad? Now, if you tell people, you know, they say white men can't jump. Somebody said black men can't swim. Huh? You got any black 7-time gold medalists? Now, again, I'm not picking on black folk, white folk. I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just saying there's just some things in the realm of sports we can at least tangibly say in the realm of sports. Why do you think it was a joke? They even made a movie about the Jamaican bobsledders. Huh? If in the realm of sports we cannot find equality among the species or among the race of humans or among the ethnicities, why do we allow ourselves to get lied to concerning every other aspect? Do you think it's just a joke that Chinese people do math real good? You ever see the computer programmers? They're all from India. Huh? Isn't that funny that even our numbers are called Arabic numbers? Huh? That doesn't bother you? Isn't that funny? I'm just saying there's going to be some stuff that we say that's going to get people mad. But again, these are things that literally fill in the puzzle, and they let you know why this system literally takes hold of people and deceives them. People are going to get mad. All right, let's go on and read. They had eminent parents, thus combining Darwin's concepts of the survival of the fittest with class-conscious question, who's your daddy? If this sounds like an experiment, a Nazi experiment gone wild, consider that in the late 19th century, the United States joined 14 other nations in passing some types of eugenics legislation. 30 states had laws providing for the sterilization of mental patients and imbeciles. At least 60,000 such defects were legally sterilized. Of course, to determine who was dirtying the gene pool requires extensive population statistics. So in 1910, the Eugenics Records Office was established as a branch of the Galton National Laboratory in London. It was endowed by Mrs. E.H. Harriman, wife of the railroad magnate Edward Harriman, the mother of diplomat Averell Harriman. Mrs. Harriman in 1912 sold her substantial shares of New York's Guaranteed Trust Bank to J.P. Morgan, thus assuring his control over that institution. After 1900, the Harrimans, the family that gave the Prescott Bush family its start, along with the Rockefellers, funded more than $11 million to create a eugenics research laboratory at Cold Springs Harbor, New York, as well as eugenics study at Harvard, Columbia, and Cornell. Now, who is Prescott Bush? See, this is for those people. Now, how many of y'all hear people saying things like, oh, George W., all he's interested in Texas oil? How many times you heard that? How many times you heard people complain about, oh, George W. Bush, he's just a Texas oil man, and now all he cares about is Texas oil or Enron? Huh? Remember they were blaming him for Enron? That's that electric company that went belly up that took all our money because that idiot Gray Davis gave it to him. We had that big $4 billion, I think it was $11 billion surplus, and Gray Davis gave it all away, and then Enron goes belly up. How you go belly up after you raped California for that much money? And how many of you heard George W. Bush get blamed for that? Because he said, Enron's in Texas, and they're his buddies. Now, understanding where these people got their start, you think the Bush family needs money? Huh? The Harrimans, the family that gave Prescott Bush family its start. The first International Congress of Eugenics was convened in London in 1912 with Winston Churchill, the director. How many knew Winston Churchill was in charge of trying to purify the race? Huh? Hey, Winston Churchill. Obviously, the concept of bloodlines was highly significant to these people. Now, let's play race relations. These people. What people? How many of you know, like, you can be white, but you ain't these people. All right? So I don't know what you're, that's why I try to tell black people, you just try to shake them. What are you bugged out about, man? Even white people ain't part of these people. All right? You can be a white dude and you ain't part of these people, so they could care less about you. The concept of bloodline was highly significant to these people. In 1932, when the Congress met in New York, it was the Hamburg America shipping line controlled by Harriman Associates George Walker and Prescott Bush. George Walker and Prescott Bush. Anybody know what George W.'s middle name is? Walker. Oh, wow. Who did he get named after? Wow. Hey, check out what George Walker and Prescott Bush did. They brought the prominent Germans to the meeting. What meeting? The eugenics meeting. Now, who's the last people you want to invite to a eugenics meeting? Germans, man. Y'all see the boys from Brazil? Oh, y'all, you're not that old. Gregory Peck? Huh? Boys from Brazil? Y'all see that? What was that about? That was about eugenics, clones. Man, somebody was trying to tell us something back then. Nobody's paying attention. They could have used the Bush family by name and nobody would have figured it out. All right. They invited the Bush family, man, invited the Germans. You don't want to invite the Germans. What the Germans do a little later? They wanted the master race, huh? Well, where do you think they got the ideas from? The Bush family. The Rockefellers. It's terrible. I don't believe it. George Walker Prescott Bush that brought the prominent Germans to the meeting. One was Ernst Rudin of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Genealogy and Demography in Berlin. Rudin was unanimously elected president of the International Federation of Eugenic Societies for his work founding the German Society for Race Hygiene, a forerunner of Hitler's racial institutes. Rudin's work in eugenics was to a large part funded by Rockefeller money. These wealthy American families, like their counterparts in Britain, feel themselves to be racially superior, and they wish to protect their racial superiority. Anybody believe this? All right. That's enough of that. All right. Y'all know why the Rothschild married each other? Why the Rothschilds married their nieces? Huh? Pedigree. They're serious about it. These people are serious, man. You're darn right they want to keep it in the family. All right, their sons, 5 branches: Vienna, London, Naples, Paris, Frankfurt. In concentrating as we must on the financial economic activities of international bankers, we must not totally ignore their other attributes. They were, especially in later generations, cosmopolitan rather than nationalistic. And that's what Gary Allen told us. Cosmopolitan. It's a nice word, huh? That means they're high class. They're cosmopolitan. All right. Let's see. They were a constant, if weakening, influence for peace, a pattern established in 1830 to 1840, when the Rothschilds threw their whole tremendous influence successfully against European wars. We read that too. These guys backed up anybody in war, made money. They were usually highly civilized, cultured gentlemen, patrons of education, the arts, so that today's colleges, professorships, opera companies, symphonies, libraries, museum collections still reflect their munificence. For these purposes, they set a pattern of endowed foundations which still surround us today. The name of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us, and should be more so. They include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, Spires, Mirabaud, Mallet, Fold, above all the Rothschilds and Morgan. Even after these banking families became fully involved in domestic industry, by the emergence of financial capitalism, they remained different from the ordinary bankers in distinctive ways. Number one, they were cosmopolitan and international. They were close to governments and particularly concerned with the question of government debt, including foreign government debt, even in areas which seemed at first glance poor risk like Egypt, Persia, Ottoman Turkey, Imperial China, and Latin America. Number three, their interests were almost exclusively in bonds and very rarely in goods, since they admired liquidity and regard to commitments in commodities or even real estate as a first step toward bankruptcy. They were accordingly fanatical devotees of deflation, literally high volume, high value money, less goods. They were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the use of the secret for financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers. More particularly, they were known as merchant bankers in England or private bankers in France, investment bankers in the United States. In all countries, they carried various kind of bank and exchange activities, but everywhere they were sharply distinguishable from others, more obvious kind of banks such as savings banks or commercial banks. Let's see. One of their less obvious characteristics was that they remained private, unincorporated firms, usually partnerships, until relatively recently offering no shares, no reports, usually no advertising to the public. Nobody needed to know anything they were doing. Thus, people of considerable political knowledge might not associate the name Walter Burns, Clinton Dawkins, Edward Grenfell, Willard Straight, Thomas Lamont, and we'll read more about these guys, Dwight Morrow, Nelson Perkins. Some of you that got to the movie late know the name John Foster Dulles, S. Parker Gilbert. With the name Morgan, yet all these and many others were part of the system of influence which centered on the J.P. Morgan office at 23 Wall Street. This firm, like others of the international banking fraternity, constantly operated through corporations and governments, yet remained itself obscure private partnership until the international financial capitalism was passing from its deathbed to the grave. I'm going to read another paragraph. It says, the influence of financial capitalism and the international bankers who created it was exercised both on business and on governments, but could have done neither if it had not been able to persuade both to accept the two axioms of its own ideology. They had to persuade people of this. Both of these were based on the assumption that politicians were too weak and too subject to temporary popular pressure to be trusted with control of money in the system. Accordingly, the sanctity of all values and soundness of all money must be protected in two ways: by basing value of money on gold and allowing bankers to control the supply of money. To do this, it was necessary to conceal, even to mislead, both governments and people about the nature of money and its methods of operation. So the reason that people don't understand money and banking in general was because it's a secret. You're not supposed to know, because if you know, then you understand what game is being played on you. To do this, it was necessary to conceal or mislead both governments and people about the nature of money, its methods of operation. For example, bankers called the process of establishing a monetary system on gold, they called it stabilization. So basically, you're going to go through a whole section that's going to give you the vocabulary. We'll leave that one for now. Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Again, what you want to stay on top of is the facts. A lot of these guys, they draw conclusions, but we'll even talk about their conclusions, find out they were wrong. But again, when you're writing a book in 1906, 1932, 1960, who's to know where things were going? I mean, I crack up when I watch Star Trek. And Captain Kirk looks over and says, "Chekhov, how fast are we going?" He says, "Warp 3, and it looks like an odometer." You think back then they understood there was going to be LED readouts? Huh? And your choice of blue, green, or red? Huh? So they had to come up with whatever they thought was high-tech and modern. All right. Consolately in the railway station in Hoboken, New Jersey, they just watched a delegation of the nation's leading financiers leave the station on a secret mission. It would be years before they discovered what the mission was, and even when they would not understand the history of the United States underwent a drastic change after that night in Hoboken. The delegation had left in a sealed railway car with blinds drawn for an undisclosed destination. They were led by Senator Nelson Aldrich. Some of you are familiar with the Aldrich Plan. Head of the National Monetary Commission, President Theodore Roosevelt had signed into law a bill creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908 after the tragic panic of 1907 had resulted in a public outcry that the nation's monetary system must be stabilized. Now, what did we just read stabilization means? Huh? You got to match it with some gold. All right. We're done.